I asked for your word origin questions, and you kindly obliged. So let's answer a few. In another Rob words. First question is from Dan Bennett 91. What came etymologically first, the chicken or the egg? So etymology is the study of word origins, right? So I'm going to take this question as being which word is older, chicken or egg? And I've actually got an answer for that. So we borrowed the word egg from the Vikings, who actually took charge of a large proportion of England, sort of along the east there. And during that period, a lot of words from their language, which was called Old Norse, seeped into the language of the Anglo-Saxons who were already living there. Their language was called Old English. It is the ancestor of the language that we speak today. So we borrowed that word from these newcomers. Meanwhile, Old English already had the word chicken. So, from an English speaker's perspective, which came etymologically first, the chicken or the egg? Well, it was the chicken. Fun question that, I like it. Oh, mate, it is so cold out here. Next question is from Matt. Why is it passenger and not passager? Oh, very good point, right? Because the word is passage, not passage, just like the word is message, not message, but we still say messenger, don't we? Well, actually, yeah, they should be passenger and messenger, because the words that we borrow from French are passager and messager. But what happens in the Middle English period is people start putting this nasalized n sound where it previously wasn't. Specifically, they're putting it before a G. So you get it in, passenger, messenger. You also get it in harbinger, because the original French word was herberger, or alberger. They don't like H's, do they? You also get it in nightingale, even though that's a g rather than a j sound. It's a nightingale. It means night singer. This starts happening in the Middle English period. Why? Well, what linguists believe is that sound is being added just to make it easier to get to the g or j sound from whatever sound comes before it. It's what's called an intrusive n. We have other intrusive sounds in English. For example, we have the intrusive r. Have you ever noticed that if you say law and order, you end up sort of putting a r sound in the middle of there, even though there isn't one? Law and order. And we also have an intrusive y. So if I say she is nice, I've put a y after the she is, right? But there isn't a y there. That intrusive r and that intrusive y are just there to help ease the transition between sounds. And that is what linguists reckon is responsible for the n in passenger, harbinger, nightingale, and messenger. So why is it passenger instead of passager? Well, because people are a bit lazy. Should we do another question? This one is from Nar Blue. What are some common words with Celtic origin? Now, this is a really interesting one, because there are famously surprisingly few words in English of Celtic origin. Why surprising? Because when the Anglo-Saxons arrive in Britain, it's populated by Celts, the Celtic Britons. So it's really weird that they managed to take over England without absorbing any of the language of the people that lived here. Well, that's how the story goes anyway. It's debated by linguists. I mean, one of the theories is that the Anglo-Saxons moved so sort of swiftly and brutally that they didn't spend enough time with the Britons to take on any of their words. And certainly they weren't marrying and forming families with the ancient Britons in a way that meant those words made the passage across the languages like Old Norse and Old English did. But we do have a lot of words in English that are of Celtic origin from way back. Peat, bin, tor. These are all words that probably come from the Celtic Britons. There are remnants of the language of the Celtic Britons in place names, for example. So England has got, I think, 5 river Avons. Avon just being a Celtic word for a river. And there are lots of place names that ultimately are Celtic. Names with like Lynn in them, or Dun in them, or Care, like Carlisle, for example, they've got Celtic origins. But then I'm just talking about words that are still with us from ancient times, from 1500 years ago, from that language of the ancient Celtic Britons. But we have taken on Celtic words in the meantime from the languages that are still spoken in Britain and Ireland that are Celtic languages. For example, from Welsh, we've taken the word penguin, which means white head in Welsh. It's an adorable name for that adorable bird. The word corgi, as in the dog breed, is Welsh for dwarf dog. I've also taken the word bard from Welsh, which is kind of interesting, isn't it? We talk about maybe the most significant figure in the English language using a word that we borrowed from Welsh. I think it meant sort of a musician. They're a very sort of musical bunch, the Welsh. And then, of course, there are plenty of words that we've taken from Irish and Scottish Gaelic, which are two related languages. They're both Gaelic languages. They're different to Welsh because Welsh is what's called a Brythonic Celtic language, like the language of the ancient Britons, whereas Irish and Scottish Gaelic are Gaelic languages. But we've got them to thank for words like whiskey, banshee, smithereens. I know there are plenty of them, particularly when you talk about geographical features, words like crag and glen and loch, of course. Those all come from the Gaelic languages, and therefore they are Celtic words as well. Okay, I'm going to do some of these indoors because it's freezing outside. Next question. This one is from Mr. Chief 1. What is the purpose of the silent H in words like rhythm and where? Well, Mr. Chief, you've chosen two very different examples there. Let's start with rhythm, right? So the H is in rhythm because it ultimately goes back to a Greek word, rhythmos, right? Which then passes into Latin and is spelt rhythmus with an H in it to reflect the fact that the H was sounded out in the Greek word. But by the time we borrow it from French, that H isn't being pronounced. So ultimately the H in rhythm, it isn't doing anything. And the H in rhyme, if you're interested, is only there to make the word look more like rhythm. They're actually the same word, rhythm and rhyme. They come from the same French source and ultimately from that rhythmos in Greek. But, there's something that happens in English, particularly around sort of the Renaissance, is that people who are aware of these etymologies, aware of the Latin and Greek origins of words, start to try to show that off in the way that they spell those words. And we end up with letters being added back in. So rhyme was spelt R-I-M-E in English. No problem. Perfect. It was spelt like that in French. But then we start to get these weird spellings with H's in them. But you also get the B in doubt. I've told this story several times on this channel, but the B in doubt is only there because it ultimately goes back to dubitare, right? Which is Latin. Doubt was being spelt without that B in English for ages. But then the Renaissance comes and the B goes back in as a means of showing off the knowledge of whoever's writing it, It's kind of selfish. Same with receipt, the P in receipt. Recipere, that one comes from. But it was being spelt receipt, R-E-C-E-I-T, or a variation on that, for a long time before that P found its way back in. By the way, the C in perfect, that doesn't need to be there. And for a long time, it wasn't there. It was just parfait or something along those lines. But the C got put in when Renaissance scholars realized the classical origins of that word and felt like a C should be in it. But the difference with that one, as opposed to the silent P in receipt and the silent B in doubt, is that we've ended up pronouncing the C in perfect. But for a long time we didn't. Anyway, I've waffled a bit there. Point is, the H in rhythm, it isn't really doing anything. Now, the H in where, that is a different story. You've heard people pronounce where before, right? Coolwhip. English has a lot of these WH words, but here's a revelation for you. They were originally HW words. That explains why when someone says where, they're saying the H sound before the W, because these words genuinely did begin with an H that was followed by the W. The reason that all of these HW words are now WH words is the printing press. So when the presses first open in England, they're being staffed by Europeans, because the Europeans are the only ones with the expertise. So William Caxton is working with like Flemish printers, and these Flemish printers, they look at English. They see a language that has a lot of TH words, a lot of CH words, a lot of SH words, and they think, doesn't it work better as WH than HW? I know that sounds like nonsense, but that is how it goes. And we end up with all of these WH words like who, where, what, that at one time were wha, where, and what. So what's the purpose of the silent H in words like rhythm and where? Well, if nothing else, they just show us how these words were once pronounced, either in English or in antiquity. The printing press just generally made a mess of English spelling, and it obviously got even worse when English started to spread around the world and different spellings started to take hold. Did you see recently linguists in Canada have asked the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to stop using British spellings? You see, he used to be governor of the Bank of England, and he's clearly taken some of those spellings back home with him. And he's been spelling words like globalise with an S instead of a Z, or catalyse with an S instead of a Z. Very British way of spelling things, and doing that in federal documents. Well, thanks to this video's sponsor, Ground News, I can see that the linguists claim in their letter that Canadian spelling is critical to the country's identity, and using British spellings could lead to confusion. Ground News is a website and app that brings together sources from around the world and helps you to understand the coverage. On that story alone, for example, it found 50 sources, including a podcast mention. And for each one, it tells us information about the outlet, such as who owns it, any potential political bias, and most importantly, I think, how reliable it is. For example, it rates Canada's Globe and Mail as very high factuality, meaning you can have faith that you are getting good information. I've been working with Ground News for ages now because I think it's never been more important to understand your news sources and whether or not they can be trusted. And Ground News just gives you all of the tools you need to do that. If you want to get access to it, go to grounds.news/robwords or use my special QR code and you can get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is what I've got. That works out at about $5 a month or whatever your local currency equivalent is. I recommend it. Give it a go. Another question. Is there a link between the verb to maroon someone and the colour maroon? That's from Goran Newsom. Well, long story short, no, there isn't. But there are two interesting stories going on with those two words. So the first one is the word maroon, right, which is just a straight up borrowing of the French word marron. In French, that means brown, but to us, it's kind of a sort of reddy brown, isn't it? And there is a reason for that, because marron is also the French for a chestnut. Indeed, when they're calling something marron, brown, they're actually saying it's chestnut coloured. And chestnuts can be also sort of a reddish brown as well. So that kind of works. But when we maroon someone, we're invoking a completely different idea altogether. So in the 17th century in the Caribbean, the slave trade is in full swing. But every so often, one of those enslaved Africans who's been forced to cross the Atlantic and work in a plantation thousands of miles from home manages to escape from that plantation and that servitude. And what they would call one of these escaped enslaved people was a maroon. Why was that? Well, because the word maroon meant wild, right? And if you managed to escape from a plantation, that is exactly what you would essentially be doing. You'd be going wild. You would be living in the wild, the wilderness. So when we maroon someone, what we're actually saying is we're sort of leaving them out in the wilderness. So those two words, maroon and maroon, actually not related, but both got pretty cool stories. Okay, next question. From Surya Chatterjee 1061. Are there any English words or trends that have disappeared for some time before coming back into common usage? This is a great question. Yes, I can think of one. Collective nouns. So terms for collections of objects, people, animals. So in the 1400s, there was a fashion for a type of book called a book of venery, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And these were books that promised to teach the reader how to behave in polite society if you wanted to move up in the world. So they taught you how to train a falcon. They taught you how to hunt. They taught you how to behave in court, as in like, a royal court. But what they also did was teach you the right words to say. And in a particular book called The Book of St. Albans, which is beautiful and one of the very first books to be printed on a printing press in England, describes dozens upon dozens of collective nouns, particularly for the sorts of animals you might encounter whilst you're out hunting. There's a lot of birds in there. And it's from this book that we have terms like a murder of crows, a murmuration of starlings. There's also a watch of nightingales in there. But it's not just birds, there are other animals in there, like a business of ferrets, which is a personal favourite of mine, a sleuth of bears, but you also have a pride of lions and a litter of puppies. They're actually called a litter of whelpies in the book, but whelpies is just an old word for puppies. We get those terms from these books of venery from the 1400s. However, these books come out in the 1400s, and yeah, a few people read them, sure, but those collective nouns, they don't catch on. By the end of the 1500s, no one is using them at all. But then in the 1800s, attention returns to these books because they're kind of fun, but they're also very interesting cultural artifacts. And so you've got the Victorians reading through these long lists of collective nouns, and it captures their imagination. And then terms like murder of crows start to be used. Pride of lions starts to be used. And we've still got them now. So these words disappeared for 300 years, and then they came back. So is there a trend that has gone away and then come back? Yeah. Collective nouns like a pride of lions.
Another question, why are the O's in monkey and donkey different? Yeah, so they're pronounced differently, aren't they? Monkey, donkey. Well, you know what's interesting? Donkey wasn't originally pronounced donkey. It was pronounced donkey. The reason that donkey is spelt the same as monkey is because it used to be pronounced the same as monkey, just with a D instead of an M. The first place that the word donkey turns up is in a fabulous book called The Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue by a guy called Francis Grose. He spent his time travelling around London by night time, or the dockyards, or at universities, basically anywhere where he felt he could pick up slang. And one of the words he came across was this word donkey for an ass, although when he heard it, it was being pronounced donkey. When it came to putting it in his Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, he thought, okay, I'm going to write this like monkey because that's what it sounds like. But over the years, we've ended up pronouncing donkey instead of donkey. So why are the O's in monkey and donkey different? Well, they weren't always, but pronunciations change, don't they?
Let's do another one, shall we? Ed Hardy 1054 asks, in English, why are first and third Germanic in origin, but second isn't? Yeah, so Ed's absolutely right here. The words first and third are Germanic. They go right back to Old English, and indeed modern English being a Germanic language, whereas the word second we have borrowed from French. How has that happened? Well, let me explain what each of those three words literally means, and then it starts to make a lot more sense. So first, right, the st at the end of that is related to the st at the end of most, or at the end of greatest, biggest, loudest. It's a way that Germanic languages make something the most of something. It's a superlative ending. And what first is the most of is the for. It is literally the foremost. The words are basically semantically, as in terms of meaning, exactly the same. So that's why we use that as our word for the premier thing. I suppose we would, if we wanted to use a French word, we would be using premier, but we don't. We use first. It is the foremost thing. Third, it's a derivative of 3. It is the ordinal number, the ordinal version of 3. Ordinal numbers are first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. Right. In fact, third was, up until as recently as like the 17th century, spelt thrid, which makes more sense, doesn't it? Because 3 is 3, not thea. I made this point in another video where I was talking about animal name origins, because bird was originally brid. It's a very common thing for those sounds to switch around like that. So yes, third is also Germanic. So what's the deal with second? So as I mentioned, second is borrowed from French, but it ultimately goes back to a Latin word. And it's a Latin word that actually meant the following. So second is distantly related to words like sequence and consequent, because they all relate to things that come next. So second doesn't mean the thing that comes number 2 necessarily. Originally it means the thing that comes next. But the thing is, English didn't have a word for that. Old English didn't have a word for that. The word that Old English would use when it needed to express the thing that comes after first was other, as in the word that we use now. So you'd have first and then the other thing. That's rubbish, isn't it? So when William the Conqueror comes over with his French-speaking pals, English speakers seize upon that word that the French have conveniently got for a thing that comes after first but before third, and borrows it. So that is why first and third are Germanic words, but second is not. Can I just quickly ask you a question? Are you subscribed to my channel? Because I've just been looking at the stats and it says that most of the people that watch my videos are not subscribed. I am getting tantalizingly close to a certain 7-figure milestone. I would love it if you helped me get there a little bit faster by clicking subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, but it's a way to support this channel. It's really easy. Just click it down there now. Thanks. Next question is from Timothy Dias, 4727. Could you explain why is it that on William the Conqueror's coins, his name is spelled Pilliam? You're really playing into my hands with this one, Timothy, aren't you? He's right. So if you do look at one of the coins from William the Conqueror's day, so the 11th century, they say on them, or at least they appear to say on them, Pilliam Rex, meaning King William. But it's definitely a P at the start, not a W. So what's going on there? Well, no, it isn't actually a P. It is an old letter called win. You see, Old English, and indeed modern English, has a lot of w sounds in it. So you can think of when, where, what, but also words like weapon. It has way more w sounds in it than even other Germanic languages, because those all tend to turn into v sounds in other Germanic languages. Have you ever noticed that? So if you want to write out Old English, you really need a letter for that sound. The problem is, the Latin alphabet of old didn't have a letter for that sound because it just wasn't all that common in Latin. Romans weren't starting their words with w sounds. So what were the Christian scribes who wanted to write out Old English to do? They needed a letter for that w sound. Well, what they did was resurrect one of the letters from the previous writing system that had been used to write out Old English, namely runes. One of the runes that had previously been used to write out Old English was this one. It was called win, and it made a w sound. How convenient. And it is actually this that you see at the start of William's name on those coins. It is not a P, it is a win. Now there's an obvious problem with it, isn't there? It does look too much like a P, and that is probably why we're not still using that old rune. Instead, we are using a double U or a double V to make a W sound, like in Latin words like equus, right? It does make more sense than using the win, because then, well, I mean, you'd have all sorts of problems, wouldn't you? Like will would look like pill, and want would look like pant. So your wants would also be your pants. I'm sure there are funnier examples than that. But anyway, why does it look like he spells his name Pilliam on his coins? Well, William the Conqueror was simply using a win.
There was, of course, another runic letter that stuck around for a long time, and that was thorn, my favourite. You know, sort of P on top of a B. It made a sound that currently we require 2 letters to make. It made the th sound, a sound that is common in English but not common at all in Latin. So again, the Christian scribes needed to borrow a letter from this old system of writing. And thorn continued to be used until like the 15th century. In fact, there is still a remnant of it that you'll occasionally see. When you see a sign that appears to say ye olde, bear in mind that the Y at the start of ye there was not originally a Y. It was a thorn. The reason that there's a Y there now is that the printing presses didn't have a thorn letter. The printing presses came over from Europe where they were not using that character. So they approximated it with a Y. And that's why you've sometimes got the word the spelled in a way that looked like ye. The has never been ye. If you look below this video, you'll see that I sell t-shirts with hardcore thorn written on them. That's because I am very much of the opinion, I'm hardcore about it, that we should bring back the letter thorn. Icelandic still has it. Why can't we? Let's save ourselves the bother of having to type TH every time we want to type a th word. And that's really often in English. Let's bring back thorn. Thanks. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, I reckon you might be a word nerd. In which case, you'll enjoy something I've got planned for April. I'm going to be doing a live show called Rob Words Live at London's Bloomsbury Theatre on the 11th of April. I was just planning to do a one-off show in the evening, but tickets have sold so well for that we've added a matinee on the same day. So now there are 2 opportunities to come along and spend a couple of hours talking about the history of English, why English is so odd, and what we could perhaps do to fix it. So join me for Rob Words Live, London's Bloomsbury Theatre on the 11th of April, now at either 1:30 p.m. or 5 p.m. I'll leave a link to tickets in the description.
Okay, question from Leia Colours 8967. Why can you be overwhelmed, underwhelmed, but not whelmed? Ah, well, I've got news for you, Leia. You absolutely can be whelmed. Whelmed is a word that we don't use very much anymore. In fact, probably no one uses it at all. But traditionally, whelmed has meant to be overturned or capsized, right? It's the sort of thing that might happen to a boat when it's hit by a big wave. Overwhelmed is really just an emphatic version of whelmed. It's just, I've been completely overwhelmed. I've been completely thrown over. I've been completely overturned. Underwhelmed only exists because overwhelmed exists. It doesn't actually make a lot of sense to be underwhelmed when you know that whelming is overturning, but we needed an opposite notion to the idea of being absolutely astounded, right? So we invented underwhelmed. But yeah, you absolutely can be whelmed. This is reminiscent of a phenomenon known as lost positives, or sometimes they're called orphaned negatives. You know how you can be ruthless, but nobody talks about you being ruthful. But you actually can be ruthful. Ruth is mercy. So if you are ruthful, you are merciful. These are terms that have been used reasonably commonly in the past, but not anymore. Another one is gormless. You can be gormless. Can you be gormful? Well, not really, but gorm was a thing. There was an old phrase that was to take gorm, which meant to pay attention to something. Gorm is kind of regard. So if you're gormless, basically you're not paying enough attention to things. You're not really switched on. Orphan negatives, lost positives. I did a video about them. Go check it out.
Now a question from Unbalanced Entry. Do you think English 1,000 years from now will be more or less recognisable to modern English than that of 1,000 years ago? So will the English of 1,000 years from now be more different to today's English than Old English, basically, the English of 1,000 years ago? Well, Old English is completely incomprehensible to the modern English speaker. Have a look at it. It's like trying to read German or something like that. In fact, there are aspects of it that mean a German speaker might find Old English easier to read than a modern English speaker. So they are incredibly different. Will English be, so different in 1,000 years as to basically be another language? I mean, I'd be interested to know what you think about this. By all means, put it in the comments. I mean, obviously nobody knows, but if you do want me to stick my neck out, I'll say no, I don't think it will be as different as that. I think because of the global nature of English, widespread changes will be a little bit harder to bring about. Plus, it's really hard to imagine the kind of cataclysmic event like the Norman invasion, meaning that English is just completely revolutionized by contact with another language. But 1,000 years is such a long time, isn't it? So, and it could happen as well, couldn't it? But it is worth considering what could change in the sort of nearer term, less than 1,000 years, because I think we can kind of predict some of that. Do you know Simon Roper? He has a really good YouTube channel where sometimes he will talk in an English of old.
Lo, I travelled far. I live now on a farm with sheep and goats.
But also he's attempted to predict what a British English accent will be like in the future. Specifically, I think it was a Southern English accent. He predicted, for example, that the th sound will become a f sound because that's really common in the estuary accent already, which is the accent of Southern England.
Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
So maybe far from bringing back the thorn, we're going to end up not needing it because everyone's going to be saying free for 3 and 30 for 30. It could happen because a lot of people already do that, but maybe that will become the dominant way of speaking. In terms of grammar, something that I think will change in much less than 1,000 years is that we will lose some more of our irregular verbs. So you know how the sort of default way to create the past tense is to put ed at the end of a verb, right? So play becomes played, want becomes wanted. Well, we still have some verbs where that isn't how you create the past tense, right? Teach becomes taught, buy becomes bought. I can see a future where they become teached and buyed. It sounds ugly to us now, but that has been the direction of travel. We've just been slowly shedding irregular verbs over the centuries, and I see no reason why that won't continue. But will, in 1,000 years, English be as unrecognisable to us as Old English is to us today? I don't know, maybe. Okay, and that'll do. Thank you so much for submitting your questions. You submitted so many that I'll probably end up making another video along these lines. If you've enjoyed this, I recommend watching this video next. Do check out Ground News and Rob Words live. And can I ask you once again, go on, subscribe, get me to the 1,000,000. Until next time, take care.